Hi, welcome to the CIDCI Online Salon Series. I'm Margie O'Driscoll, and on behalf of the CIDCI Board of Directors, I'd like to welcome you here today. The Center for Innovation in the Design and Construction Industry is a not-for-profit organization that relies on your financial support to provide these programs. Thank you to our sponsors who make all of this possible. As we begin our time together today, we would like to extend our solidarity with our Ukrainian partners and the people of Ukraine. The Russian invasion is not only a war on Ukraine, but also a threat to democracy, human rights, and world peace. International collaboration is at the heart of CIDCI, and we are proud of our international partners across the globe. We stand with the people of the Ukraine. Today, we're going to be discussing knowledge. Expertise is the most valuable asset of any design or construction firm, and often companies are selected on price rather than expertise. How can we manage and grow expertise and knowledge in our organizations? What is design and construction knowledge anyway? And how do we make it actionable in a collaborative environment? Our speaker today, joining us from his home in Switzerland, is Chris Marolf. Chris is the founder of Applied Experience, a software startup in the field of knowledge management for the AEC industry. He has over 25 years of pioneering experience in the field of knowledge management and has worked with large owners, GCs, architects, and CMs in the Bay Area and Switzerland. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Margie. Good. Well, thank you for inviting me to this presentation here. I'm excited to talk to you. I'm sure I know some of the people in the audience. But what I wanted to talk to you today about is something I've been interested in for, like you mentioned, over 25 years. How do we learn from our experiences, and why do we always make the same mistakes? Maybe real briefly, something about myself. I grew up in Switzerland. I studied construction management in Zurich at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology before I began my career in the Bay Area. In San Francisco, I first started out working for a subcontractor, then a large general contractor. I also worked for an owner, and then finally started my own software company with the issue of knowledge management, and did that for several years. Then back in 2012, we moved to Switzerland. Here again, I worked for owners, general contractors, construction management companies before restarting the software company I mentioned before. Now, it's interesting, the issues are actually always the same. It doesn't really matter if you're in Switzerland or in the US. We always have these difficulties of sharing knowledge and making expertise work. And that's what I would like to talk to you about today. I'll first start out with talking about experience, what that really is, why it matters, come up with a framework for that. Then we'll talk a little bit about knowledge management specifically, what that is, how it should be structured so we can share it. And then finally, I'll show you a practical model for how to make knowledge management work in practice. So first, let's get started with expertise. And why is expertise so difficult to deal with? Expertise is actually what we think we are good as companies, what we sell. You know, for yourself, either we're good at building hospitals, sports stadiums, data centers, high rises, infrastructure, whatever. It's that what sets us apart. But in order to have this expertise, you have to have a way of sharing the experiences that you make on your projects. How do you share those from one project to the other? How do you make sure your employees are aware of that? So in other words, you actually need to make your expertise or your experiences applicable. And that's what we want to look at first. But like I mentioned, the problem with expertise is the following. In the construction industry or the design industry, we all talk about expertise. That's what we sell. And if you look at websites, these are just some examples of what you see on different websites. But just to pick out a few things here, we don't build like everyone else. We go beyond where the client needs and missions take us. So in other words, in this case here, we do more than the owner even asks us for. We do all these innovative things. We lean into challenges. Sounds really good. We do an awful lot of things. But really the question is that what we get hired for? Because we may think in this project-centered environment, we get hired for our expertise, but actually I wonder if that's really the case. If you contrast that to another industry, the products industry, or here retail, you can ask yourself, don't we also get hired on price? If you look at Target or Walmart, they're very specific about their value statements, right? You get more, you pay less. And in their case, quality is good enough. They're very efficient at delivering on that value statement. But for us, that is much more difficult to do. The reason it's more difficult to do is because we're in a people-centered environment. And if our employees have to deliver more and get paid less, we've got a problem. These people are going to burn out. Also, Target and Walmart are really good at delivering their services in a very consistent manner. And in the construction industry, where it's so people-centered, that is much more difficult to do. And without these systems and processes in place to prevent mistakes or human errors, we're never going to be able to do that. And this kind of leads us to the core problem as far as I'm concerned. And that is preventable surprises. You can boil it down to that really in a nutshell. Because we found most surprises in the construction industry are actually predictable. We did a study once for a large biotech firm where we looked at change orders, and we found that actually 90% of all change orders could have been prevented if you would have recognized the problem ahead of time. But those problems were recognizable. So most of our surprises are predictable. The other problem is that there's a real lack of transparency in the design phase. The responsibilities are not as clear. The orders are not complete. And it's just much more difficult to understand what's going on compared to the construction phase. In the construction phase, it's obvious, right? You first have to pour the concrete slabs before you can put in the flooring. There's just a certain logic to the construction process that's not as apparent in the design phase. The other thing is that the important questions don't get asked at the right time. And you kind of slap your forehead and think, well, yeah, we should have thought about that. But for some reason, we didn't. We should have known about that. The other problem with preventable surprises is that project team members spend about 25% of their time resolving problems that were actually predictable. That figure comes from when I do presentations at seminars and stuff like that. I always ask the attendees, what percentage of your time do you spend with preventable problems? And the answer is surprisingly consistent. It's always 25 to 30%. And actually another 25 to 30% gets spent on tasks that people consider were actually not really their responsibility, but somebody else's. So in other words, huge inefficiencies if you think about that. And then the other problem is that these surprises increase project costs by about 1.5%. That's a figure that comes out of that study we did for the biotech company, where we analyzed what kind of savings could we have achieved if we had reduced the number of change orders. And from the point of view of a general contractor, that amounts to about 0.6% of the project costs. There, the big issue is that those costs actually come directly out of fee erosion. So these figures may not sound that big, but if you're talking about a $100 million project, those are some serious numbers. And now moving on here, the problem that we have, and I'll get to that in a moment, is that we have a much more spread out value chain than other companies, than other industries. And that's why it's much harder for us to catch these surprises. But about that a little bit further into this presentation. First, I would like to talk to you about what is knowledge really, when we're talking about knowledge here at the core of this presentation. And I'm not talking about knowledge as textbook knowledge or what you learn in building codes or stuff like that. To me, knowledge is what you see on a job site. If you see this picture here, for instance, and you're an architect, you're a general contractor, you're an owner, you should be immediately asking yourself these kind of questions like you see on the right here. I'm not going to read them in detail, but you know what we're talking about here. It's actually all these kind of questions of coordination. Have we coordinated this with that? Have we thought about how that's going to work? In a way, it's like street smarts. It's about making things work. It's about finding solutions. But at the core of it, it's all about these experiences that we've made on past projects and how do we apply them to future projects. Now, next up, for this to work, knowledge actually has to be transferable. I mentioned that before, knowledge from one project to another or from one project phase to another. And here, the main thing you should be asking yourself is, where does your knowledge really reside in your company? Does it reside in the heads of your employees, or does it reside somewhere else in your company? And that's important for several reasons. What I'm showing you here is, again, an example from a website. This is from a Swiss website, but I'm sure it's the same in the US. Companies always advertise how good their employees are, and there's nothing wrong with that. And then on the other hand, what they advertise is we have all this expertise. You know, we've got expertise in building hospitals, we've got expertise building museums and stuff like that. But ask yourself, where does that knowledge really reside? If it's in the head of the employees, you've got a problem because those employees can leave. They retire or they just go elsewhere. In the example you see here, this company had an employee turnover about 70% in a time frame of about 3 years. So the expertise that they advertise here, industry specific, that's simply not there anymore. Another manifestation of that problem is if you're an owner and you're hiring these kind of service providers, be it an architect, be it a construction manager, you're going to ask yourself, am I hiring the expertise of the company, or if I get unlucky, do I just get an employee who's not that good, who doesn't know that much? Those are very valid questions that need to get asked by an owner. Where does this knowledge really reside? Something else you can ask yourself in this context is, if you're a large firm, what's your advantage really over a small firm? You know, as a large firm, you've got a huge overhead. And if you don't have ways of sharing knowledge between all these different employees, you may not have that advantage of expertise over these smaller companies that may be more efficient, more nimbler. Another thing to keep in mind is that the larger companies get, the less good their employees tend to be. It's just a regression to the means. And small companies can pay high salaries, can find the best employees. Large companies can't do that to that extent. So ask yourself, if you're working for a large company, how do I make sure that the size of my company bears this knowledge sharing, makes that possible? But at the core of it, the core of the problem is that you can't scale people. And so now let's look at how we can make this knowledge transferable in the next step. First off, I mentioned it before, knowledge needs to be digitizable. You have to be able to make this knowledge transferable. What I'm showing you here is a very simple value chain of a project. I drew this sequentially here. There's other ways of looking at this with more modern methods of project delivery, but just bear with me here. This is a rather simple method. And we start out with defining the requirements, then we go into design phase, a bid phase, a build phase, and an operating phase. And in classic plan, do, check, act method, we always start off with a kickoff phase where we think about what are the requirements, what do we need to do in these phases. It ends with some QC phase where we do a review. And actually the experiences that come out of these reviews should flow back to the earlier phases. What have we learned? What did we realize? What works, what doesn't work, and so on. Now, I mentioned it before, what distinguishes our industry is that we have a very long value chain here. This can be years from the build phase, from the design phase to the build phase. And that makes it much harder than in other industries. It also makes it harder to transfer that knowledge just in the head of the people, because if you have a project that goes 4, 5, 6 years, chances are that you're not going to have the same people on that project for that long of a period. The other thing you need to ask yourself is, where do you exactly add value in this value creation chain here? Because in the beginning of these phases here, you're adding value probably more likely by providing solutions. In the later phases, you're probably just adding value by minimizing the downside. In other words, making sure things get built exactly according to plans, preventing safety incidents, and so on. I think you need to be very specific about what services do you provide in this value creation chain and where do you fit in there. And if you think back to the examples I showed you earlier, those statements of experiences from the websites, those are relatively fuzzy compared to something like this here. Where do you provide value? So in summary, we need to be able to digitize our values, our knowledge, so it can move up and down this value chain. There's a couple of other points I would like to make here. One is about decision making and structure, and the other one is about organization. First off, structure. What you see on the left here is how we tend to treat knowledge. We tend to treat knowledge just as something in these strict silos within our company. Be it a subcontractor, be it a general contractor. We just think about what kind of expertise do we have, but we don't really think about how does our expertise fit in with the requirements or the expertise of other companies. In reality, how it should work is something like what you see on the right here. This is some urban park in Switzerland. It's this 3-dimensional steel structure where instead of these skimpy flower pots on the left, you've got these plants growing up in all directions, horizontally, vertically. And that's actually how it should work. Knowledge being transferred horizontally through those phases that we saw before, knowledge being transformed between these different swim lanes or different disciplines in a project. Something else we need to keep in mind here is how is a project organized? How we think a project is organized is what you see on the left here. If you look at an org chart, there's always the project, then there's an owner, then there's an architect, there's an owner representative, there's a construction manager. Everything revolves around this project. But in reality, it's something much more akin to what you see on the right here. If you think of it, the owner's got maybe 10 different projects going on at any given time. The architect's working on several projects. The general contractor has about 40 projects. And it's something that's really dispersed. And as a result, much more difficult to share knowledge within the project team, because everybody's working on multiple projects at the same time, can't pay the same amount of resources to this project here. And also something else to keep in mind is the turnover. In this model on the left, you may have like one architect and maybe one general contractor, people who accompany the project throughout the whole duration of the project, 4, 5, 6 years, like I mentioned it before. But other service providers, be that trade contractors, be that specialists, be that designers, they just come in and out of these projects. And so they provide a lot of solutions. They see a lot of different projects besides this particular project here, but they don't have that coordinative knowledge that, say, the architect or the owner representative has. And that's an important distinction, because you've got this these people in these coordination roles that spend a lot of time on one project, and they have this coordination knowledge that we saw earlier on that slide with the corridor in the hospital. Remember I told you there that a lot of the expertise is coordination knowledge. But on the other hand, somehow you have to find a way to capture all that knowledge from the specialists and bring that back into this uh, project environment or this coordination environment where everybody can participate. So this is just outlining at a relatively high level how knowledge management works and what the things are to think about. What I would like to talk about next is specifically how we can how we can digitize this knowledge or make it transferable. And there's a lot of different ways you can transfer knowledge. And the classic things, you can have workshops, you can have training sessions, you can have conversations by the water cooler. That's all good. That's fine and dandy, and has its purpose in a project. But what I would like to focus on here is one particular method, and that's checklists. And I mentioned that just because I think checklists are a relatively good way of transferring knowledge. There's one example here. This is actually the glove of the astronauts from the Apollo 11 mission. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, who were the first people to walk on the moon. And here what you see is their glove. So when they get off the lunar lander, they walk down the steps, they set up their cameras, they start walking around. And on this glove here, they've got a very basic checklist, which tells them what they need to think about. I actually love this picture because, on one hand, it's rocket science, what they're doing here. I'm sure they've practiced this stuff a million times back on Earth, but on the moon, it's the first time they're doing this. And so they resort to very basic methods here, even though it's rocket science. They just put a checklist on their glove with all the things they need to think about. It's kind of like writing something on the palm of your hand with a ballpoint pen. But it works. And it makes this knowledge actionable when they're right there on the moon. And I would like to show you some other examples of how other industries have dealt with this here. Take a look at this here. On the right, you see a checklist for a pilot in an Airbus A340 for takeoff and for landing, just the kind of things they need to think about. And something that always puzzles me is when I talk to people in the construction industry and I mention checklists, they say, well, that's okay for young people, for newcomers. But me, I've been in this industry for 20 years. I know how things work, and I'm certainly not going to use checklists. But on the other hand, I'm always very glad if a pilot in the front of the plane uses a checklist when I fly somewhere. And the other example here, bottom left, is from surgery. There, a surprisingly common problem is wrong side surgery, where surgeons, and they're certainly all well qualified too, but still it happens that they operate on the wrong side. So left hand instead of right hand, right foot instead of left foot, and so on. And what's common to all these situations is that checklists work in situations where the stakes are very high, where oversights can be very expensive. And it also works in situations where there's a lot of situational stress. You're going into a surgery, things need to move quickly, planes taking off, planes landing, things need to happen properly. Same thing in the construction industry. And that's where checklists work. What are some examples in our industry? What things you would put on a checklist? And again, these are very simple things if you think about it, but it's maybe like in the design phase. How are the corner details solved? Or how are material transitions solved inside of a building? Or how are recesses coordinated, or penetrations in walls? Or layouts in ceilings, or openings and clear spaces? Or how do we bring equipment into a building once the openings are being closed up? Or equipment, how does the electrical supply work? How are the sensors wired and stuff like that? Those are all the kind of things that can have a very big impact on a project. And basically, they're relatively simple things to think about if you get right down to it. But if you forget about it, you've got a problem. I mean, I know that from my own experience in my last project where I was on as a project manager. I thought everything was going very well. We're humming right along. The project was doing great. But somehow, on the other hand, I always knew that something was going to blow up big time in this project. And I just couldn't put my fingers on it. I didn't know what kind of problems we were going to have in about 3 or 4 months. And the reason for that is just because we didn't have these prevention tools. We didn't know what kind of questions we should be asking right now in order to prevent problems 3 months down the road. And we'll get to that first later. What I would like to show you now, real quick, before we leave the topic of checklists, is this here. Take a look at this. On the left, you see the reduction in fatality rates in the airline industry. This goes from 1970 to 2019, and you see the dramatic decrease here. The reason why is pretty obvious, right? I mean, in the aviation industry, you've got oversight boards, accidents get investigated very thoroughly. They look at material defects, they look at process issues, they look at human errors, and so on. And they enact changes in a rigorous manner. What you see on the right here is fatality rates in construction. And granted, this curve just goes from 2003 to 2015. That's the longest I could find. But still nowhere near the dramatic decrease as in the construction industry. And obviously there's a reason for that. And you probably know as well as me why that is. But let's now talk about a model for how we can make this knowledge applicable in our projects that I was talking about before. And what we need is to come up with a framework for us to be able to ask these important questions at the right time. So how do we make sure that what I was talking about earlier, that our ability to anticipate problems, to ask the questions well ahead of the time when the problems occur, how do we do that? And for that, we come up with a very simple process model, actually, which I'd like to show you right now. First, we just start out with something with these phases. I came up with something very basic here: schematic design, design development, and so on. You know it well. Then afterwards, we ask ourselves, what are the decisions that need to be made in all of these phases? Decisions by the owner or by the design team. And what kind of products are required in order to make these decisions? And products, that can be anything. That can be concepts, that can be designs, that can be models, whatever. And then afterwards, we come up with these different functions or these different swim lanes. Who's involved in this project? Who's going to be doing what? So you have maybe an authority having jurisdiction. You've got the owner, architect, designers, later on the trades, then you've got specialists, and you've got a general contractor. And next we can ask ourselves, who's going to do what to create these products? You can have these reciprocal tasks like you see on the left, or you can have sequential tasks. It doesn't really matter. But that's just a very simple process model for how design and construction works. And now what's very important is, with this kind of a model, we can ask ourselves what kind of questions need to be asked when. That can be organized by trade, that can be organized by process. But again, like I mentioned earlier, it's these issues of coordination. Are these things required? Are they coordinated? And so on. And specific examples, these are from that earlier slide you saw with the doors in the hallways. These are now questions that you could be asking yourself in the schematic design phase or in the design development phase. And like I mentioned earlier, in construction, these dependencies or these sequences are much clearer, but in the design phase, they're never that clear. That's why I think you need some sort of a model like this here to make your whole knowledge sharing initiatives work. We've been working on this kind of a design model for the last year and a half, actually, now, with a bunch of industry representatives in Switzerland. And this is just a small section of the design phase here that I'm showing you here. But again, you've got up on top the decisions, then you've got the circles there with the products, and then you've got the different activities in the swim lanes. What needs to happen when? And if you look at this in a schematic way, you see at the top with the decisions and the products, you can answer questions about scheduling, what kind of decisions need to be taken when, what needs to happen in terms of resource planning. Do we have enough resources to develop these products? What's the quality control, these products that facilitate these decisions and so on. It's commonly known as design acceptance criteria. Then at the bottom, you've got these issues of pull planning or last planner. So all these lean concepts. You've got the modeling of internal processes and knowledge. And what's important here too is how do your internal knowledge management requirements interface with the different swim lanes? So what do you need from other service providers to provide your services? And that whole thing just gives you this flow up and down. You see at the bottom how tasks are performed, those lead to products, those lead to decisions, and it comes down and it continues on through the whole process. But that's a model that you need in order to really think about knowledge sharing and when to ask the important questions in a project. Next up, I would like to show you just a couple of slides real quick from this knowledge management software that I mentioned to you earlier. The software actually works like a virtual coach that guides people through the projects. And by people, I mean architects, I mean designers, I mean owner representatives. We've got all kinds of different people using this software. But you've got a knowledge database where you can organize your knowledge either by project management topics, that's on the top left, or by trade topics, technical issues. And those are organized into these different phases, like I showed you before. This example here, by the way, is from a European general contractor who's using this software. Here you see just one screenshot for concrete. These are all their questions that they need to be asking, organized into these different topics. You can further sort this then by project phase. But again, it comes back to what I was mentioning before, asking the important questions at the right time. You can do a bunch of other things in here too. You can come up with worksheets then, where as part of the planning process, you say, what are the things we need to think about in this design phase or in this construction phase? Who's going to be responsible for it? What do we need to do? How do we check to make sure that that lesson has really been applied and so on? So you can create these worksheets, you can create these inspection checklists and so on. You've got the overview of the whole project. And finally, there's also a tool to capture challenges or problems in the ongoing projects, record those, and then as part of a lessons learned process, transfer them back into your knowledge management database so they're instantly available to other projects. So anyway, that's just a real quick rundown of how to think about knowledge management. We first put it in a larger framework, then we talked about knowledge and what knowledge is. I gave you some conceptual ideas about how to think of knowledge in a phase model or a functional model. And then I just showed you some examples from the actual software. Now to wrap it up, I would like to leave you with some lessons learned or some recommendations. And that's these things here. One is problem prevention is actually really difficult because as far as I'm concerned, in our industry, we lack the prevention tools. Everybody always talks about how the construction industry is firefighting, and we're good at firefighting. But if you think of it, ask yourself in your environment, how many tools do you have to actually prevent problems? And for me, the answer to that question was I actually didn't have any. And that's why it was so difficult to prevent problems. And think of how you can come up with problem prevention tools. The second lesson is that traditionally companies are very good at managing documents, but we're not good at managing data. And so what we end up doing is we end up putting all our lessons learned and things like that in checklists. And those are Excel spreadsheets or Word documents or PDFs. And nobody ever looks at those things. You can't believe how many companies I talk to, and everybody says, Yeah, we've got plenty of checklists, but nobody looks at them. So you need to come up with a way to make your knowledge dynamic and come up with dynamic checklists instead of static checklists. Also, everybody's talking about integrated project delivery now. And from my experience, it's really difficult to have these IPD discussions if you don't know what kind of questions you should ask. I talk to subcontractors or trade contractors, and they tell me, yeah, we get invited to these IPD meetings, but then the architect doesn't know what kind of questions they should ask us because they don't understand our trades well enough. And so we can't really have meaningful conversations. And that's another thing that you should keep in mind is how do you convert your expertise into questions that you can use in these IPD settings. And something else I've learned is acquiring knowledge is best done in conversations. You can have checklists and you can have software and stuff like that, but really to talk about what really happened in our project, why did it happen, who was responsible for what, how could we prevent that problem in the future. You still need to talk it over with people. You can't just come up with those solutions on your own. So somehow there have to be conversations involved. Another interesting lesson is that most of these experiences or these questions that need to be asked apply to the early project phases. As part of our software, we've got a database with 1,600 questions and process questions. There's about 600 questions. And if you look at them, only about 15% of all those questions pertain to the construction phase. And if you think of it, it actually makes sense. If you resolve all the problems in the design phase, it actually should be smooth sailing in the construction phase. So much fewer change orders. And the last thing here, sharing experiences frees up time to focus on better solutions. And sometimes people tell me, well, we don't want to use checklists because then everybody just goes by the checklist and nobody thinks anymore. Or somehow architects may say, well, checklists, if I just go through checklists, I can't be creative anymore. But actually, you should think of checklists as just a process tool that frees you up to come up with innovative or creative solutions. These checklists or these software tools, what they do is they just help you on the downside. They're like a virtual coach I mentioned before, but they still should give you all the time in the world to shine and come up with your innovative solutions. And these software tools, let's also be very clear, they don't replace the whole company culture. They don't replace communication and all those other things. They're just one tool in your tool chest. But so anyway, that's just a real quick run through. I'm sure you probably have a bunch of questions now, and I'd like to turn it over to Margie. Do you want to ask questions, or shall we turn it over to the audience?
I'm going to go ahead and start with one. Have you seen any differences about how the industry approaches knowledge sharing in the United States versus your European clients, specifically in Switzerland?
Some things are different. Some things are exactly the same. What's exactly the same is we've got the same problems, same breaks in the process, same questions. I mean, some of the technical questions are exactly the same. It's amazing. What is different is the contractual environment. Here in Switzerland, architects play a much bigger role in the project delivery through the construction phase. So that's somewhat different, but fundamentally it's the exact same problems.
I'm going to ask a forward-thinking question of where do you think the next frontier is for knowledge sharing?
Good question. I think as far as I'm concerned, where we need to get better is at predicting problems. What we have right now is we have these kind of tools to understand what do we need to be thinking about, what kind of questions should we be asking now, what should we be coordinating. But I think what would be really interesting is if we would be able to understand what kind of problems are we going to have, 3 months from now or 6 months from now, based on what's going on in the project right now. That would add some significant value to the whole project team and also to the owner. Maybe could have that kind of forward-looking insight.
In your experience, who holds that responsibility?
Well, I think it's everybody, right? It's all the service providers who, as we saw on their websites, promise that they will bring all this expertise to bear. But on the other hand, I think it's also the owner, because or the owner should have a very large interest in this, because if you think of it, the owner pays for these mistakes, these change orders that are the result of preventable mistakes. And if I was an owner, I would ask, service providers, how are you going to make sure that your knowledge from past projects gets applied to my projects? Because I'm tired of paying for the same mistakes over and over again.
We have a question here. Given we have an industry based on competitive bidding, how do we protect IP and yet share knowledge across the industry?
I think the knowledge that we're talking about here, this asking the right questions at the right time, sadly, a lot of that knowledge is not proprietary. Those examples I mentioned before, how are corner details handled? How do you deal with material transitions and so on? How do are openings large enough? Those are the kind of things that everybody knows about or should know about. The challenge or the skill is applying those lessons to the projects. But I don't think there's a whole lot of proprietary knowledge involved here. That's not the challenge.
We have a question here. It's great that applied experience can enable the move from a static checklist to a dynamic checklist. What are the barriers for transferring into a recommended checklist, as people are busy working on multiple projects and don't often have time to retrieve relevant questions?
I think you have to make it as easy as possible for people to just on the fly record their challenges. And that's what we do with our software, just write down 1 word or 2 words. What are the problems you're dealing with? And then later, as part of a lessons learned session, discuss what those problems really meant. I think it's also good if you let some time pass between the initial frustration and once you discuss those lessons, because I found what initially appears like the problem may, in hindsight, turn out to be something completely different.
We have a question here from Dean Reed, one of the board members from CIDCI. Are there organizations that are capturing, sharing, and using knowledge well? In other words, do you want to tell us who's doing it right? You can also throw someone under the bus if you think they're doing it badly, but perhaps it's easier to just talk about who might be doing it well.
There are a couple of innovative companies here in Switzerland that I'm aware of. But one thing I have noticed is knowledge sharing is actually not as easy as it appears to be or it should be. And there's a lot of, to me, it's something of first you need to learn to walk before you can run. And there's some companies that want to get right into knowledge sharing and knowledge management. But as long as you don't have the processes in place and this phase model or this way of thinking, it becomes very difficult to share knowledge. So there is a certain sophistication that you have to have before you can meaningfully share knowledge.
When you and I first started talking about doing this presentation, I was really struck with one of the things that I had been taught when I was in college, which is that knowledge is power. And so how willing are you to share power with other people by actually sharing knowledge? Which I found to be a really interesting concept, and I think we face that in the workplace now, and it's particularly frightening for complex projects where there's one singular go-to person and for a particular issue or problem, and then that person somehow is unavailable. Then what happens for an organization?
Yeah, but in the world of Google and the internet, there's plenty of knowledge to go around. And I think the challenge is, like I said before, it's making that knowledge or that expertise applicable.
Mhm.
You can always find knowledge if you search for it long enough,
Mhm.
but the real art is to make it applicable. And I think there's a downside to what you mentioned too. I've come across people who have said, I mean, not very many, but who've said, no, I'm not going to share my knowledge because it makes me dispensable. But then those are the same people who, in the same breath, say, well, and I know exactly what kind of problems are going to happen on this project, but I'm not going to speak up now because 2 months from now, I'm going to have to step in as a firefighter and solve that problem. And that justifies having me on a project, which is actually a real scandal, that way of thinking.
We have a couple of technologists on the call who are here watching us live. And I wonder what your thoughts are about software as a tool to facilitate knowledge management. And obviously, it can succeed with some things, but there are some limitations. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think knowledge software tools need to tie into all the other tools, regardless of what they are, like building information management, um, project platforms, and so on. Um, but I think they can also function independently because knowledge sharing goes beyond just data management or coordinating models or stuff like that, clash detection. It's really the problem of knowledge management has been around for way longer than building information management has been. And so, how to communicate, how to transfer those experiences can function independently too from those other software tools. But I think it's really powerful if they all work together.
I want to ask about building owners, and you've mentioned them in your talk, and I'm wondering how they play into knowledge sharing initiatives and how building owners share information, how what a best practice might be, and what are some of the challenges for the project teams?
Well, I think owners need to be clear on what role they play in the project. That's another difference between Switzerland and the US. I think in the US, at least in the Bay Area, owners are much more involved in the projects. In Switzerland, they tend to be hands off, and they say we just purchase a project and we expect it to be coordinated. I think their US owners are more realistic and want to be involved, and I think they need to be involved because, in a sense, they need to be the holders of the knowledge, right? If you're a hospital provider or something like that, you want that knowledge about what works and what doesn't work within your organization. I wouldn't want to rely on the general contractor or the architect to have all that knowledge.
So you talked a little bit about IPD, and I'm just wondering about how knowledge management ties into other initiatives like BIM, Lean, quality management, et cetera. How do you take all these different tools and try and bring them together in a way that actually works to deliver something beautiful for a client?
Well, lean and last planner and things like that, I think there it applies as follows. I see oftentimes companies say, well, I'm not really interested in what happens before I come on board. Let's say a subcontractor or a contractor says, I just want plans from the architect and they better be right. But how those plans get developed doesn't interest me. And with a knowledge management initiative, you would be able to ask meaningful questions, like architect, have you thought about this? Or it would really help me if you did it like that, constructability issues. Or have you thought about we could solve it like this? So you can have those kind of conversations. And the same thing applies to those last planner conversations with those different swim lanes we saw before. Um, I mentioned it for IPD, where knowledge management or being able to ask the right questions at the right time can facilitate those kind of conversations that you have um, in IPD or in ICE sessions or stuff like that. Because one thing I see often here is uh, designers say, well, we're not going to do anything before the architect tells us what to do, because otherwise we just waste our time. And the architect says, well, I'm really disappointed in the designers because they don't come up with solutions. They always have to be told what to do. And we don't understand their world well enough to tell them what to do. So the two don't really talk to each other. And I think if you have a way of bringing these expertises or these experiences to the conversation, you can facilitate those kind of conversations.
Very interesting. We have a question here from Samir. Knowing that knowledge is power, how do we incentivize knowledge sharing among employees in an organization? Boy, that's worthy of a whole conversation, a whole webinar. But can you give us some of your thoughts about that?
No, actually, that's the easy part,
Oh,
surprisingly. What I found is the difficult part is getting people to think about what are the challenges on the upcoming, in the next phase. People hate doing that. Nobody likes to sit down and think about, okay, I'm moving into this and this phase. What kind of problems could I run into? Nobody has the time to just sit down and think those things through. But what is surprisingly easy is to talk about lessons learned afterwards. And I think it's because people want to share their lessons, their war stories. They want to talk about them. They want to be recognized for them. Um, and inherently, people don't mind sharing. So when we implement this software, that's actually the easy part, is getting people to share their experiences. And to me personally, that's encouraging because I always enjoy learning new things, and it's nice to see people sharing their lessons. And I think maybe Samir's question seems to be widespread. People think, well, people are not going to share knowledge, but actually, when it comes right down to it, they do.
I think that we're getting to the end of our time together. So I wanted to give you just a moment to say anything that you maybe forgot to say, or you wanted to answer a question that I didn't pose.
No, not really. I mean, I always enjoy talking to other people about this topic because there's not many people interested or aware of knowledge management. Even though it's something that touches everybody, we're all faced with the problems, but there's not many people that think about it systematically. So if there's anybody out there in the audience or wherever and you're interested in talking about this, please get in touch. I'd be happy to talk to you more and share experiences. But other than that, I don't have anything.
That's a beautiful way to end. Chris,
Yeah.
it was so great spending the morning with you. Well, your evening, and have a wonderful weekend. Most of us here on the West Coast are just beginning our Friday, and it was just a wonderful way to spend our morning. So thank you so much for sharing so much great information and so much vision for all of us. We're so appreciative.
Good. I hope you enjoyed it. And
Great.
have a nice weekend too.
Thanks. This concludes CIDCI's online salon. The session will be recorded and placed on the CIDCI website and YouTube as soon as possible. To join us for future webinars, be sure to subscribe to our newsletter on our website, CIDCI.org. Next month, on April 22nd, CIDCI will host an entirely different conversation with Richard Harpham entitled The Rise and Fall of Katera, Lessons Learned. Less than a year ago, venture-backed startup Katera filed for bankruptcy, wiping out nearly $3 billion of investor money. Katera was closely watched by the design and construction industry with their plan to bring the electronic industry's end-to-end manufacturing processes to the construction business. We'll unpack the story of technology and ambition. Special thanks to Katie Olson for keeping us on track and our sponsors who make all of this possible. Thanks for joining us. And as always, if you have thoughts or comments, please reach out to us via the CIDCI website's Contact Us link. Have a great weekend.